with a story that we're all very familiar with, and that is Moses sending out the spies. And so it is in chapter 13, it begins where the Lord says to Moses, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a leader among them." Kind of an interesting thing here that in the book of Deuteronomy, the statement is made that the people asked to send spies. And I think this is just one of those times where we have an idea that came out that God either allowed or instilled in others. And it just gives us this sense that everybody thought this was a good idea, that Moses thought this was good. The Israelites thought this was good. God wants them to do this, to send out these spies to the land. So they're going to go out, and they're going to go out and select men. It says in verse 3 that are heads of the tribes. What heads of the tribes? Well, one thing I think is that it's likely that, if you're going to come back and tell, a story, you want to hear it from the most reputable people in your group. So that's going to be a sense of why these men were sent out there, why they're sent out to accomplish these things. They're going to go basically through the entirety of the region. Took a map here and stuck down our origin point of Kadesh Barnea. It says they went all the way up to Rehob, up top, and Rehob, if we have this down right, is all the way up by Damascus, which is as far north basically as the Israelites would ever be. So they go over this area. This is not a ton of land that they're covering, and that's always the thing that's a surprise, is that Israel is not very big, that it's very small. To say as comparison, what you're talking about is a journey that's basically from Portland down to Cottage Grove, let's say, south of Eugene. That's really the area that they're going to go, and they're going to spy this out for how long?
40 days.
40 days. And what they're going to do, verse 18, it says, see what the land is like, see what the people are like, whether the land is good or bad, whether the cities are there strongholds or their camps, if there's forests. Bring us back some of the fruit from this land. So they're given a fairly straightforward mission to go out and to spy out this land. So they go out and they spy out the land, and verse 25 says that they come back and they return to the Israelites. They all come back and they bring back the fruit of the land. Verse 27, it's interesting what they say. They say, we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. So in other words, what Moses has told them and what God has promised them is true. No surprise. The land is as great as we thought it would be. The land is fantastic. Nevertheless, verse 28, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. We saw the descendants of Anak there, and there are Amalekites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites, all around here. Now, one of my most favorite lines in this, one of my favorite things is that now jumps up one of the two spies comes out there. This is Caleb, and Caleb says, well, let's go. I love that because we know why the spies are saying there's a lot of fortified cities, a lot of strong people. It's almost as though Caleb doesn't even process that that's an issue. Well, let's go. I grab my sword, grab my spear. Let's just get this done with. I can't wait. I've already picked out the place I want to live. Caleb is on fire, ready to go. Verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people. They are stronger than us. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report, saying, this is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people we saw are men of great stature. He goes on to the very last verse to say, we were like grasshoppers in their sight. So here we have our bad report. I like to kind of make this point because I think this is so important. All 12 spies went to see the same land. Who's our other guy that went to the land? It's like Caleb? Joshua, right. By the way, kind of interesting point. I think, Michael, you did a class on Caleb a few years ago, I want to say. Does that look, you're giving me the look of you don't remember. But one of the things I always thought was interesting is that Caleb gets a lot of attention here. Not so much like Joshua. And I wonder if some of that's because Joshua already being Moses' second person is just kind of assumed he's going to be on the right side of things. But Caleb, you notice, gets singled out a lot. And I also wonder if maybe it's just the idea that Caleb was particularly on fire to get this done, that he really was excited to move forward with this. All 12 spies saw the same land, they saw the same cities, they saw the same blessings, they saw the same things that they would need to overcome. And yet you get these two reports back. One is bad, one is good. One is, this isn't going to work. One is by Joshua and Caleb, that this is possible. What super important idea is in that concept? The idea that 12 people saw the same thing, 10 said, we're ruined, 2 said, we can do this. What is the really, really, really important thing that we need to walk away with understanding tonight, Teresa?
2 of them were walking by faith. The others were walking by sight.
By sight. I love that you said it that way, Teresa. 2 walked by faith and saw no problem. 10 walked by sight. I love that. I love that. Because this idea is they just saw the obstacle. They didn't see God involved. What else can you say about this? What else can you say? 10 guys saw only the worst of things, and 2 guys saw the best of things. And what's that going to do to Israel? Yes, it's going to, very next verse, chapter 14, verse 1, the whole congregation lifts up their voice and they weep that night. And they begin this process of complaining about what it is that they have. This is a conversation about attitude and perception. Attitude and perception. And the idea is that when we look at obstacles in our life, a lot of times we are, going back to what Teresa said, we're walking by sight. And we're just seeing the problems, and we're lacking the faith to appreciate the solutions. I think it is so easy to fall into this trap of only seeing the worst in things. Let's say, let's talk about our congregation. Do we say, well, you know what? It's so hard to get people converted. We're just never going to win this battle. We're going to try and try and try. I don't even know why I send out cards every week. Do you think you could feel that way? I think you can feel that way easily. You know, why do we even bother trying? Because it's just not going to be successful. Can you see how that attitude reflects what the Israelites are going through right here, right? It's so easy for this attitude of loss, of failure, of this fear of being overcome to permeate and to destroy. That the danger within a congregation is that if we allow people to have a consistently, can I just say it like this, a consistently bad attitude, they can contaminate and destroy the whole church. That's what happened when 10 men, how many Israelites do you think are adult-wise are going to die at the end of this 40 years? 2 million, let's say. 10 men are going to get 2 million people killed with a bad attitude. If there isn't a better testimony of the danger of having a bad attitude, I don't know what there is. And all I can say is that that is the thing that is provoked here, that provokes God the most. That when Paul, going back to our 1 Corinthians chapter 10 statement where he talks about don't test God, that the concept is a bad attitude is a test of God. And I don't mean in a good way. I mean you are provoking God to wrath. You're provoking God to wrath when we have a bad attitude. That should be terrifying.
So I always thought it was funny because like last week we complained about having to eat manna and quail and that's all they could eat. Now someone brings back a report that said if we go into this land, it's full of not just manna and quail anymore.
Right.
But they complain or they don't see how this is like a solution to their complaint.
Yeah.
And let's go in there and get rid of them so that we can eat grapes so big that they have to it takes two men to carry.
Yeah.
You know, I don't, that's odd.
Isn't it interesting that so often, like I said, that the very thing that solves our problem, the very effort that we need to put forward to solve our problem is the complaint that we have. You know, the very effort of being spiritual and growing ourselves that'll solve our problems of our struggles with worldliness is the very thing we resist the most in life. I don't want to go to services and be with other Christians all the time, and yet that's the solution to your problem. You know, that's the thing that actually makes your life better. But we just aren't prepared to commit ourselves to it, and that's a huge thing.
I think it's also a good example of the idea of you have to have your faith built up before you put it to the test. That, you know, these 12 men go in, and 2 of them already had faith that God was going to give them what he had promised them, and the other 10 just saw all the problems.
Yeah.
You know, it was because Caleb and Joshua already had that they made it through this.
You know, what you're saying is interesting, Grant, because it's a point to say, if you heard what Grant said, that if we don't have faith before the trial begins, we're probably not going to be able to build it during the trial. I always think of building faith as like building a sandcastle. You gotta have your sandcastle ready before the wave comes. Because if you ever tried to build a sandcastle while the waves are coming, and the answer is, well, you can't do it. And so the point is, you have to have your concept of faith established ahead of time. And you're right. Caleb and Joshua went there with an attitude that they knew before they got there that God would be able to get them through that. And that's how they looked at everything. They said, well, look at this big city of Jericho. That's a pretty fortified city. Boy, it's a good thing we got God on our side to help us take care of this. That shouldn't be a problem. And then they see the blessings of that. And we can have these fields, and we can have these, look at all these things that they've built up here, and they'll be ours once God takes care of that problem. But the people that didn't have that faith, all they're seeing are the obstacle. They're not seeing the opportunity. And like I said, I just can't say enough. So many times the reasons that people put on Christ and then take him off and then fall away is that they just allow themselves to see the worst of things. And they just see the obstacle and the difficulty and the frustration, and they see it, like I said, they see it in the world around them, they see it in the church, they see it in their brothers and sisters, and they allow that attitude to poison them, and then God gets angry and God acts, which is what's going to happen here. Of course, we see in chapter 14, Moses and Aaron, verse 5, fall on their faces before the assembly of Israel. Verse 4, right before this, they're going to pick a leader. They're going to go back to Egypt. And it's outrageous, but that's their choice. We're going to go back to Egypt. Verse 6, Joshua and Caleb tearing their clothes, and they're trying to tell everybody, look, this land is great, they're saying in verse 7 and 8. And if the Lord delights in us, he'll bring us in here. Verse 9, just don't rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people. I love this. They are our bread, meaning we're gonna eat them alive. We're gonna destroy them. They are our bread. Their protection has departed from them. The Lord's with us. Don't be afraid. Now, here's what's even more remarkable. Here is this very good advice, this very truthful observation. And verse 10, how's it received? Yeah. The people now turn on Caleb and Joshua, and they want to put them to death. And that seems to be the final straw. Suddenly, verse 10, they turn to Joshua and Caleb, and they're about to do them in. Suddenly, God's glory appears. The glory of the Lord appears at the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. So Moses says so the Lord says to Moses, verse 12, that's it. Verse 12, I will strike them with pestilence. I will disinherit them. And he says to Moses, and he said this before, I will, back in Exodus 34, 6 and 7, I will make a nation out of you, Moses. I've had it. Now, I don't know. I don't have a great answer to the question of, does God really mean that? Because I'm not sure what this conversation is meant to reflect. Is God genuinely saying, I'm ready to do this, or is God testing Moses? You might say that on the one hand, that the very fact that Moses is able to persuade God not to do it is a strong indicator that God is merely testing Moses, and I'm okay with that. But on the other hand, the Bible's very clear that God listens to Moses. And there's been several times in the Bible where God put something out there to do, and righteous men interceded, and God listened to them. This is profound. Not really prepared to deal with it too much tonight, but it really is profound. And all I would say is that when James says that the fervent, effective prayer of a righteous man can avail much, that verse in James chapter 5 could mean more than even we can dream of if we're petitioning God and God genuinely listens to us. That's just a really heavy idea. Tacho, I saw your hand up. Do you have a comment or question?
Aside from Egypt, where else could they go?
Where else could they go? And the answer is nowhere. They're stuck in a little peninsula. It looks like a thumb pointing down, that there's not a thing on it. And other than Canaan, they can go to Saudi Arabia, but that's not much better. That really Egypt is about the only place that they could go. So to some degree, Tacho, you're making an observation that maybe that's just their only choice as far as they see it. So here they are. God has said, I've had it with them. And Moses begins to reason with God. Moses begins to reason with God. In verse 13, Moses says, well, the Egyptians will hear about it. They'll hear about how you brought them out of the land. And then they're going to hear about this, what you've done, and they'll tell it to the inhabitants of the land. And they have heard that you, Lord, are among these people, and that they've seen your face, that you go before them. And if you kill these nations, he says in verse 16, they'll start saying, because the Lord wasn't able to bring his people in the land. What's Moses' argument here? Yeah, who would look to the world? You're right.
Israel.
How Israel and God's relationship would look. Moses is saying, God, if we think about this, and again, this is incredible that Moses is negotiating like this. But he says, let's think about this in that if you destroy these people, what do you think all the world's going to think? Now, do you think God hadn't thought of that? I'm sure God thought of that. But I'm sure also we're getting one of those moments where God is having a conversation that he already knows what the conclusion is. So whose benefit is this conversation for? Moses, and by extraction, us. To say that God listens. That God listens to us. And God is prepared. The Bible will say God talks to Moses face to face. That's an important part of the book of Numbers. And God listens. What's incredible is God will listen more closely to you and I than even Moses, because of our relationship to God through Jesus Christ. That's a pretty profound idea that we can consider and we can have, that the Word of God would give to us. So Moses makes this point, and he says, verse 19, please pardon the iniquity of this people, of their mercy, of your mercy, just as you have forgiven the people from Egypt even until now. You might remember last time Moses negotiated this, what did Moses offer? Anybody remember? He said, you can do this if you'll just pardon the people. Anybody remember what Moses offered? Yeah, he said, you can take my name out of the book of life if you'll just pardon this people. And God says, that's not how I work. I don't, so Moses doesn't offer it a second time here. But God says, well, okay, verse 20, he says, I have pardoned them according to your word. But as I live, the earth will be filled with my glory. These people have seen that glory and all the signs I've done. And then he mentions the putting to the test 10 times. Verse 23, and they're not going to see the land. They're not going to see the land which I swore them. Now, verse 24, a couple of points. What's the exception to that rule? Except for Caleb and Joshua. Now, it's kind of interesting, by the way, he just mentions Caleb here. And as I said, I think the only reason he'll mention Joshua elsewhere. But it's more the idea to me that Joshua tends to be lumped up with Moses. So Caleb is kind of seen as the exception to the rule. So he gets that attention here. I don't know if somebody else has another thought about why Caleb is uniquely named here, but that's my speculation as to what this is. But the point is God says this, only those people, we might infer their wives, their children, but only they are going to go into the promised land. Everybody else, and he hasn't said it yet, but what's going to be the exception? It's in verse 29, but what's going to be the exception? Yeah. All the children will go in. He said, because ironically, you told me I was going to kill your children. Your children are the only ones I'm not going to kill. Is kind of how that goes. So he says, verse 29 is pretty rough. The carcasses of you who have complained against me will fall in this wilderness. All of you who were numbered according to your entire number from 20 years old. And he says, except for Caleb, and then he mentions Joshua here. He says in verse 31, your little ones that you said would be victims, they'll enter the land. I'll stop here. Let's kind of start off, going to go work through some questions, talk about a few things that we've talked about. But let's start off with, it's almost like we might say to ourselves, boy, we shouldn't have ordered the spies in. Which, this is where this all starts. But why do you think God ordered the spies to come in? So that's where this order originates. As I said, Deuteronomy 1 indicates the people also wanted this, but we see here the authority comes from God. Why would God do that, Josie?
Well, I think that he wanted to show them that he meant what he said about the land being fulfilled with milk and honey, and that he was just showing them that he is telling the truth, that this is going to be good.
Yeah. Now, Josie brings up something really neat, that there's something very straightforward about God saying, I want you to have witness that what I said was true. Now, Josie says it was true that God said that the land was filled with milk and honey. But here's what's interesting. What else did God say about the land? What else was it filled with? Canaanites. The difficult thing, God had also revealed to them. God had told them that they would have to dispossess, but that he would help them do it. In fact, he said, I'll do it for you. But God had let them know there was going to be some trouble. There were going to be some things, some difficulties that came up in that. So first and foremost, it's important for us to see the idea that God let them know both the good and the bad. What can you think that's kind of comparable to in our life? How about when we become a Christian? What does God say is in store for us? Tribulation. I would say this, good and bad. God says that, I always think of the words where Jesus was talking about brothers and sisters that are lost. He says, for those who have to give up brothers and sisters and homes, he says there will be 100-fold given back to you in this life. What's interesting about that statement that Jesus makes is that, number one, he's acknowledging there's some bad things ahead of you. The Christian will suffer tribulation. That's a promise from God. And number two, there will be good things too. So what might be the application we think? Well, the idea is that whenever things go badly for us in life, we doubt God. And sometimes we don't appreciate the idea that what's good is better than what's bad. Sometimes that's a really hard thing for us to put together. Anybody have any other thoughts on this comment or this question, George?
Obvious that God is testing their faith and obedience, but also he's showing what true faithfulness looks like with Joshua and Caleb. They had a good example there.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of nice to say they had the right model of the right attitude. It wasn't as though they said, well, we didn't know how we're supposed to act. Because that's a good point, George. I hadn't thought about that. That Joshua and Caleb are reflecting everything about this. Joshua and Caleb aren't denying that there's going to be some work ahead of them. But they're acknowledging that that won't be much compared to what God is going to do. And that's an important point, too. I really like that. It's a really good point. Anybody else have something you want to throw at this? Ryan.
I was thinking about Deuteronomy 8:9 too, where it kind of recaps the wandering and really gives the vibe that the whole point of this wandering is so that they learn about God.
Yeah.
A lot of them probably didn't know God very well as slaves. They probably didn't really worship Him. They probably vaguely knew about God, but in the desert, they're going to spend 40 years of learning about God probably every day.
It's kind of interesting, Ryan, that there's a strong element to the idea that Israel doesn't really know who God is in Exodus 3 and 4. Whenever Moses says, if I show up, they're going to want to know who you are. And that's where God says, well, let me give you my name. And because he's going to say, especially since God hasn't talked to them for 4 generations now. So it's very interesting for that observation, because that does seem to be very true. Go ahead. So next question. In Numbers chapter 13 and verse 32, it says, they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land. They said, the land which we've gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great stature. Are they lying about their report? Josie?
No.
So,
The people were bigger and
Yeah.
healthier and stronger than they were.
yeah, good. So, one of the things I think is really important is this is a true statement. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, it's kind of true, but it isn't true of all the inhabitants.
That's a good point.
So really, they're exaggerating through this whole thing, talking about how, there's these obstacles we can't possibly overcome. And so I get the impression they're kind of painting a especially bad picture
Yeah.
of what they really saw.
One of the interesting things is that there might be a sense here where you say, it's not possible for us to overcome them. And what they're lacking is an image that says, but with God, all things are possible. When they when they do enter the promised land and they take out the first fortified city, what was the name of the first fortified city? Jericho. How does that happen?
They don't even fight.
They don't even fight. They don't do a thing. They literally march around the walls. And while we've heard that story many times, we just don't appreciate how absurd that is. You march around the city 7 times, and on the 7th time, 7 times extra, and then the city blows up. I mean, that's absurd. And yet, if there is not a better example of God saying, I'm the one that's going to do this, then that moment, that really is profound. So there might be a sense where you say, if we had to besiege the city of Jericho and build, that could take years for us to overcome, and each city could be years like that. If we're just not factoring in God's work, that's brutal. Let me just pause for a second and say, if we don't factor in God's working with us in the kingdom of heaven, then the work of the church is pretty daunting. And it's easy to fall into this trap of thinking, well, I've got to do it all, and you know what? We can't do this. We can't convert our community. We're not going to be able to stay faithful. All these things that if I'm not seeing God as my fellow worker, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, God is our fellow worker in the field. If I don't believe that to be true, then I'm definitely going to end up with this attitude. Go ahead, Grant.
I think it's really interesting that later on in Joshua, I think Joshua 14, where we see Caleb come and he asked Joshua that for Caleb to be able to basically take responsibility for conquering this part of the land that caused the spies trouble when they first went through it.
Yeah.
And almost like I want to be the one who goes in and proves that we could have done this anytime.
And at that point, how would you characterize Caleb in his life condition?
It's old.
He's an old man, yeah. We put him and Joshua in their 80s at this point, whenever they're actually entering the promised land. By the way, there's one of the things that I've always thought about as Joshua and Caleb are pleading with the people, just how frustrating it is that you did everything right and you still had to wait 40 years because of everybody else's complaints. Just how aggravating it might have been. And I had to live with these people for the next 40 years. There might have not been a day where my neighbor, if it weren't for you, I'd be in that land right now, That has to be something that you think about a lot.
It's interesting there. I think Caleb mentions there that he's still just as strong as he was, that God let him keep the strength he would need to conquer the land was part of the promise God made.
And what's very interesting is Joshua lives, I want to say Joshua was 132 when he dies. Anybody remember? Am I misremembering? Michael Hetzer, what's the answer?
I don't remember.
He doesn't remember. Okay. So that's okay. I was thinking he's actually even older than Moses is what I want to say. What's interesting is this was that point in history where people weren't living these extended lives. These guys were given extra time by God. Moses and Aaron and Caleb and Joshua, God actually gave them something extra at this point. They were at that point in history where the human lifespan had come more like our lifespan. So it's interesting that those men, and I forgot about that, Grant, that God had, he talked about the idea of having that strength, that these men were supernaturally able to. And when Moses dies, the Bible says that God had kept up his vigor to the very end of his life. And that's a really remarkable thing to think about.
Joshua was 110.
110. So I blew it. I was wrong. All right. Well, Grant, you didn't need to tell everybody I was wrong. I was incorrect.
And they had no weapons. They have weapons.
They did have weapons. Yeah, they did have weapons for sure. So it is interesting they had weapons, but sometimes they didn't need them. Like with Canaan or with Jericho, God did most of the work. Now they would fight with weapons later, for sure. We see Ai, we see a lot of the other cities in the conquest there. So they did have weapons, but it's very interesting that God ultimately was going to deliver them. Great.
I'm just curious about like with Caleb. He was from the tribe of Judah, and God said that he thought differently about things. So it's something special.
Yeah.
Now there wasn't at that time there was no kings, so like with Jesus was from the line of Jesse. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Just wondering if Saul might have been from the line of Caleb.
Who?
King Saul.
He was Benjamin. So
Benjamin.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but of course David was, from the same family. He's not descended from Caleb, but he is a tribe of Judah. I've wondered about that too. If there's some significance to Caleb being from Judah and Judah having so many heroes later in the Bible coming out of that tribe. But it is interesting that two of our earlier heroes, Joseph and now Joshua, aren't from those tribes that typically draw those heroes.
Yeah, Joshua was from Manasseh. Was that one of Joseph's sons?
That is one of Joseph's sons. Yeah.
Yeah.
So very interesting, catching that. Anyone else? So let me jump ahead to the next question then. Who is going to be allowed to enter the land? We've already said, well, let's just say it one more time. It's Joshua, it's Caleb, it's all the children. Now, why Joshua and Caleb? That's an easy one.
Their faith.
Their faith. Yeah, they believed in God.
It's not stated, but Moses and the Levites also.
At this point, yes. Now that's interesting, George. You're right. Why is that a necessary inference? George says they needed them, but also we're going to read a little further on. They're going to be barred from entering the land over some things that they're going to do. So that's interesting. George says, I'm going to give you a point, give you a Brian point there, because that's right. I didn't include Moses and Aaron and Miriam at this point, but that they would be on that list. We would assume because they're going to be taken off of the list later. So the necessary inference is they're actually on this list right now too. Good point there. Third one is the children. Now, the question is why? We know why with Joshua and Caleb. Why the children? It doesn't say it here, but it'll say it in Deuteronomy. Why the children? Why the children, Teresa?
Well, first of all, he has to have a nation.
Okay.
So you've got to have these children, and they're innocent.
Okay, that's actually the big idea that comes out of this too. In the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses recounts this, he says that the children are allowed because they have no knowledge of right or wrong. What do we call that when we talk about a child's ability to know right or wrong? We call that referencing their age. We call this an age of accountability or an age of innocence, right? I want to be careful to say this is not the Bible giving us a specific age of accountability. And we can know that because there are some people that are going to be condemned by God that are going to be under 20. They're going to be teenagers, that are condemned by God. So at least one of the kings of Israel or kings of Judah will be condemned by God, and he's just a teenager. And of course, we also have some people that, as teenagers, will choose to do what's right. So why 20? What do you think is trying to be accomplished by God setting that number as being the number where God says age of accountability? What would you guess? What would you try to answer for that?
Well, excuse me, they weren't counted in the census.
All right.
Until they were 20. Boys weren't considered fighting men until they were 20. So it's kind of like the cutoff between a child and a man. And so they're the ones that will carry forward everything in everything.
So Debbie, you're kind of almost saying it's almost like a legal number.
Right.
That's the legal age of consent, they would say, for something like that. I like that. That's an interesting point. Grant?
Kind of similar lines. I was thinking maybe these are the people who, aren't the ones making Israel's decisions, that, they're not the ones who decided to turn against God.
All right. Yeah, and again, if they legally had no right, then they would do that. I'll throw one more suggestion at you. Josie, do you have a comment?
Well, wouldn't they be young enough not to remember what God had done like the escape from
Interesting.
Egypt and all the miracles?
Some of them for sure. You know, it's only been a year and 1 month since their time, actually now 2 months because of the 40 days. But it's only been a year and 2 months. So maybe some of them remember and some might not. So that's an interesting observation. Let me say this. I think when God is establishing this, and again, as I said, this isn't a automatic age of accountability, but it is a generic age of accountability. And maybe what we might say is it's the maximum age of accountability. It's perhaps as old as a person might have gotten before God held them accountable. In other words, you know, and it's kind of a stretch, but maybe there are people that really aren't, mentally equipped to make decisions of good and evil, right and wrong until they've got to the end of their teens. But maybe this is a point to say that at this point, doesn't matter who you are, you should know right from wrong. And that certainly is an idea that we have in our legal system where we say 18, and then sometimes we say, well, younger than that, you might be accountable. It just depends on the circumstances. But the point is that God isn't giving us a specific, but maybe he's giving us an abstract with a high end towards that. Great.
When he had numbered them originally, didn't he number them from 25?
Right.
Being able to handle a sword.
Right.
And so that's where he says in here, says those who have not numbered, which was 20 people or whatever. But seems like they're going to remember it to a certain extent because he says they're going to suffer as shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years because of your sin. So they're going to suffer the consequence of their parents' sin, but not the
wage.
The wage.
Yeah, that's a good illustration of the wages and consequences. Actually, that's a real good elaboration. So as we move through here, why are they being allowed? We said this, like I said, if you wanted to read about the age of accountability, Deuteronomy 1:39 is your cross-reference there, where he says it has to do with whether or not they knew right from wrong to that degree. Why 40 years? A year for each day that they spied it out, he says. Now, by the way, this also becomes an important number for us as far as the numbering of a generation. So God will say, this is the generation that will perish in the wilderness. So it gives us an abstract number for a generation. The reason I like to remind you of that is that when Jesus is talking in Matthew chapter 24 about the coming destruction of Jerusalem, he says this generation won't have passed away before this happens. This would give you a sense to say that there would be about 40 years, and it was almost exactly 40 years later that Jerusalem got destroyed. So it's kind of an interesting, I could have maybe put that together from that knowledge. What do the children of Israel try to do when they find this out, whenever God gives them this direction?
Try to take the land.
Yeah, they decide that they're going to go out and they're going to take the land anyway. We haven't got to that point yet where they go on to say what's going to happen here, but they're going to try to take the land. How's that going to go for them? Verse 40 says they're going to get pushed all the way back. Absolutely nothing comes of that. So that's the end of that point. Just got a couple of minutes left. Numbers chapter 15. God begins talking to the Israelites about sin offerings. I think that's kind of key here because they've got a lot of sin offerings to offer because they've just blown it. Now, one of the things that comes out of this chapter when it talks about the offerings that you have, and he talks about how you have to have prescribed altars to offer these things on, and that the priests are the ones that are working through these sacrifices. This will become important for us as we move throughout the history of Israel. That God only wanted sacrifices done certain ways. One of the big things was it had to be at the right kind of altars, the places for offering these things, and it had to be the right people that were offering them. And we'll see a number of times in Israel's history where they go to another altar. In fact, what was their favorite altar to go to that wasn't God's prescribed one? Anybody know? Well, Bethel and Dan, actually, that's good. Yeah, that's actually the Israelites of the north will go. I was thinking the high places come up a lot, that they'll want to go offer sacrifices in the high places. But Dan and Bethel certainly are two places that later pop up. People making sacrifices that aren't supposed to. We know King Saul will be guilty of that as well. He goes on to talk about the idea that sometimes sins are committed by ignorance. And when a sin is committed in ignorance, God just overlooked it, right? No, what happened? You still had sacrifices to make. One of the things to kind of think about here, if we'd had a little more time, we would have talked a little more in depth, is that in the New Testament, we'll be given this sense in the book of Hebrews that there's two kinds of sacrifices that are offered before God. One is the sacrifice for sin, and one is the sacrifice that is the gift to God, the gift to God. Why is that important to know in the New Testament? Well, because do we offer sacrifices today? Teresa says yes. Anybody want to agree with Teresa? I'm going to give you a hint. Teresa's right. But I'm going to say, George said, yeah, but George, doesn't the Bible say Jesus was a sacrifice once and for all? To reconcile those two statements, we have to know that there's two kinds of sacrifices. There are the sacrifices that are gifts to God, and there's the sacrifice for sin. The sacrifice for sin, George, how do you answer that? That's Jesus's once and for all sacrifice. But the sacrifices that are gifts to God, Teresa, I'll put you on the spot. What are some of those?
Well, the sacrifice of our lips is one.
That's my favorite, one of my favorites.
The sacrifice of our bodies is a living sacrifice.
Living sacrifice, Romans 12. Yeah, another good one. So the Bible talks a lot about us being sacrifices and giving God sacrifices. It's not talking about sin sacrifices. It's talking about gift sacrifices. The sin sacrifice has been offered once and for all. The book of Numbers chapter 15 here is elaborating more on sacrifices. And it's giving us a few ideas that, as I said, if we had more time, we would apply them more directly to being a Christian. It has to be the right kind of altar. What altar do we offer? Hebrew writer talks about us offering an altar in Hebrews chapter 13. It says it's the altar that you could say is our heart. What is the priesthood that offers this? Us. Yeah, we're the priests of God. What does that mean? The Bible says you are priests and kings. He says you are the royal priesthood, he says somewhere else. Those kinds of statements are saying you and I have the right to offer sacrifices, to partake of the blessings of the altar, he'll say. And that's, again, Hebrews chapter 13. But what does that mean about people that haven't put on the priestly robe of Christ? What are their sacrifices? Yeah, Josie shakes her head. They're not acceptable. That's what Numbers 15 is trying to convey. George?
They're like Cain's sacrifice.
Good point. They're like Cain's sacrifice. A very good point. Well, this brings us to our close of time. Wish we could have talked a little more about the tassels here. I think that's an interesting thing to go into, but we'll move out of here. Thanks so much for all the good comments, Terry.